Our next speaker is Julie Turko, and I just want to briefly say that a lot of us, including me, hi Mom, are here because of really supportive and positive families, and not everybody in the world gets that opportunity, and I'm always amazed when somebody goes from doing something as a career that creates a tremendous amount of social good. Julie has worked with foster children in that incredibly difficult space for a long time, and has transitioned from that to working on climate, which is another incredibly difficult, complex issue with a lot of dependencies and a lot of people that could be hurt or saved. So this is somebody who's really picks important, crucial things that have real human impact, and has worked really hard to be in this program. And really, I think what stood out to me is just how engaging she's been in our discussions, and how much, even as an instructor, she's really pushed me to be a better communicator, and really have appreciated having her in the program quite a lot this year. So Julie, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Aw, thanks, Corey. So, as the world is accepting climate science as the basis for transitioning to a clean energy economy, the United States has actually been slow to act on the federal level. States, cities, and companies have taken the lead instead, creating sustainability plans and assessing their climate risk. With this new administration, President Biden is proposing sweeping investment across government in the pursuit of climate goals. And I wanted to take a closer look at whether or not the US is in a position to make good on a net zero promise. Although the history and politics of climate change are complex, the central issue is the accumulation of carbon dioxide and its equivalents in the atmosphere. The more we continue to emit, the larger the problems we will face as global warming accelerates. We still have an opportunity now to try to mitigate the effects of warming if we can drastically reduce or even reverse our greenhouse gas emissions. The Biden administration has laid out a substantial roadmap for action in its proposed budgets and legislation, and this helps us to understand what comprehensive federal climate action might look like. Also new with the Biden administration are national climate goals announced by the White House. By 2030, less than 10 years from now, the administration is proposing a 50% reduction of net greenhouse gas emissions and 80% of electricity to be generated from zero carbon sources. Both of these are midpoint goals with a target in mind of net zero emissions by 2050, a goal that aligns with other international targets. This sounds great, but in some ways, we are only just now getting started on building and scaling the technologies we would need to get there. As we've heard today, lots of these technologies we've been talking about are in that pre-commercial phase. And part of my question also is to wonder, why are we not already leading on this as a country? The United States understands the problem of climate change. We helped create the problem, as our economy has been built on cheap and abundant fossil fuel energy. But our federal leadership has never been unified. The executive and legislative branches have never been unified on climate issues, going all the way back to the Kyoto Protocol, signed by President Clinton in 1998, but then left unratified by Congress. In recent years, we've seen our presidents swing wildly back and forth on climate policy. President Obama attempted to establish a national plan to curb greenhouse gases, and then the subsequent Trump administration reversed EPA regulations and other protections, and over 4 years, climate goals were scrapped. Now, President Biden has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, created new positions in working groups, and has made clean energy central to his infrastructure plans. So, as a country, how are we doing on climate? Well, it turns out, in fact, that in the latest Green Future Index published by MIT in January, the United States ranked 40th out of 76 leading nations along the parameters that you see here: carbon emissions, progress on a clean energy transition, a green society, including consumer choices, clean innovation, environmental protection, and climate policy. Our presidential inconsistency and our lack of comprehensive legislation has led to the United States being viewed internationally as an unreliable actor on climate. In theory, the federal government could be playing a huge role in climate mitigation using the strategies seen here: reducing emissions through regulation, setting goals, incentives, and penalties, tax policy perhaps, investing in common green resources such as infrastructure, helping to bring new technologies to market, and using national intelligence and data to make better informed decisions. And in some federal agencies, these sorts of activities are indeed already happening. The problem is, they're not yet making a dent in our greenhouse gas emissions. Whatever our promises may have been in the past, in Kyoto, in Paris, the fact remains that US greenhouse gas emissions, seen here, have been quite consistent since the early 1990s. The United States emits around 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide and its equivalents per year. And the slight decrease that is seen after 2007 is attributed to changes in energy demand and the switch from coal to natural gas rather than climate policy. We see a slight dip for the recession. No doubt there's another dip for COVID. But if we're going to get to net zero, then this is the size of our decarbonization problem, the amount we will need to either reduce or offset. If we look at our emissions by sector, we can see that the largest contributors are transportation, the generation of electricity, industrial processes, and residential and commercial buildings and their efficiencies. The federal government is involved in all of these areas, and the vision set forth by the proposed Biden budget addresses carbon reduction in all of these sectors. But here's the thing. The president does not set the federal budget, but rather requests budget funding from Congress. So now we're back to understanding the political context within which this request is being made. We have a president, on the one hand, who wants to go big on climate, using the development of clean technologies to strengthen federal infrastructure and to create new jobs. We also have a Congress that is deeply divided along partisan lines and historically reluctant to agree to any measures viewed as a disadvantage to the United States. What is new here is the fact that society is actually changing, and Congress is hearing not just from environmental groups, but also from the corporate and financial sectors who are internalizing the risks posed by a continued reliance on fossil fuels. Both groups now are advocating for stronger federal action, and disagreements in Congress are less about the realities of whether climate change exists and more about the spending, scale, and speed of an energy transition. In fact, we do have an example of a bipartisan agreement, which was tacked on to the very last appropriations bill of the Trump administration. The Energy Act of 2020 was the first energy bill to pass in the last 13 years. It is a directive to the Department of Energy to assist with the research, development, and demonstration of clean energy technologies, including wind and solar, and giving a nod to fossil fuel interests by pursuing carbon capture and by giving coal another job to provide rare earth elements. The Senate committee that put this law together collaborated with House committees over several years of bipartisan negotiation and is a good example of interests on both sides being represented. However, the bill carried with it no extra funding for the Department of Energy, and a single bill for electricity generation does not address the full scope of the climate problem. So what other solutions are needed? The Biden plan requests additional funding for every federal agency with either a research or a regulatory role to play on climate. The list of major agencies is here, and whether or not these agencies receive the funding requested by the president depends again on Congress. In addition to regulating emissions standards, the success of a comprehensive climate strategy depends on the availability of adequate substitutes for technologies that are problematic. The Biden plan proposes to use federal subsidies to support the research and development of the technologies seen here, to position them for rapid commercialization. Wind and solar already qualify for an investment tax credit as they were furthest along in development and proven in different markets. The strategy overall is to help pay for the costly demonstration phase and then move these technologies to market. Although climate change is tied directly to issues of land use, food security, and the protection of valuable ecosystems, a nature-based solution in the climate context often refers to the ability of nature to sequester carbon directly from the atmosphere and includes measures such as replanting forests or practicing regenerative agriculture. These activities are becoming increasingly supported by the market for offsets, where companies, for example, might fund an agriculture project to offset the carbon footprint of their operations, if in fact additional carbon sequestration can be proven. Although not a quick way to secure carbon reductions, the human relationship with nature is an important part of the problem in dealing with climate change. In the transportation sector, the Biden plan proposes to support the electric vehicle market through the procurement process. Say that 10 times fast. By purchasing EVs for the federal fleet and building 500,000 new charging stations nationwide. The plan has implications for consumers as well, who may be persuaded to rethink their automotive purchases with point-of-sale rebates or other incentives. And finally, just a mention of carbon pricing, even though this is not currently part of the Biden narrative. Economists favor the approach of putting a price on carbon, either through emissions trading or a direct tax per ton of CO2 to reduce carbon emissions. In the US, there are regional cap-and-trade systems, and there is currently a proposed carbon tax in the House of Representatives, but these measures have not gotten traction on the federal level before. There is debate about whether the carbon price can be set high enough to be effective, and actual carbon reductions attributed to these programs are unclear. But when they are deployed, the revenue received can be used to fund other climate and environmental projects. So the United States cannot single-handedly solve global warming, but it can cooperate more closely with the international community to solve this global collective action problem. Successful climate mitigation depends on the additive participation of as many countries as possible. And as the world's second largest greenhouse gas emitter, it is incumbent upon the United States to do our part, to use our relationships and our resources to reduce carbon around the world. So, with all of these potential tools at the disposal of the federal government, are conditions for success in place for a net zero promise? If we based our answer on the historical pace of congressional action and the longevity of presidential leadership, the answer would have to be no. We still do not have unified leadership on climate, and in the very short term, right now, heavy spending elsewhere has already been approved in the nation's COVID response and in the sweeping package just this week to strengthen the technology sector. Fortunately, the good news is that climate progress does not depend solely on federal initiative. Progress in the private sector can drive progress on climate policy. So as much as I might advocate for support of the Biden plan, as a citizen, I would also say this. Industry, please finish the engineering problems that you started before you even began production. Please figure out your processes, figure out your waste products, and capture and repurpose your own emissions instead of releasing them into the open air. Congress, please help industry to do that. And while you're at it, please rally together amongst yourselves to agree upon our national climate goals. We need a new vision from you for the future. And what about we, the people? We have our own role to play in reconsidering our transportation and consumer choices so that every trip in the car does not contribute to the global problem. The federal government has an opportunity right now to partner with other states, nations, cities, and companies who are already leading the charge on climate. Together, perhaps we can make some progress. The science tells us that we have no time to waste, so let's please get to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Any questions from the room? Miles.
Thanks, Julie. I think that was a really fantastic presentation. And from your research and just staying in the news, what do you think Congress will do, or more so, what will it take for Congress to come to some type of unity around the climate crisis?
It's a good question, because I think one thing that Congress is resisting about climate policy is the sort of big vision that the Biden administration is proposing. It seems like they want to take it in discrete chunks, kind of topic by topic, department by department. Here is the small thing that we can all agree on, rather than a sweeping change where, they raised the alarm that taxpayer money might be wasted because we are investing in research and technology. We don't know what the return on that investment will be. So it seems to me like Congress takes the approach of breaking the problem down into smaller pieces, and that would be fine. The way they did with the Department of Energy, for example, that was a 2 to 3 year process to get that one energy bill, for the Department of Energy in place. But if we are to believe that every delay creates larger problems later, that doesn't seem like a very good approach to hash things out for 2 or 3 years before you can give specific agreed upon goals to a department within the administration. So I think what's important to keep in mind is that if I were answering this from a partisan point of view, I think each side has to understand what the other side wants. And the unity comes from not saying that I get my way and you don't get your way. I need to figure out a way that I get my way and you get your way to some degree, that there's a compromise in the middle. I think that's the only way that I can see of creating that common ground.
Kind of on that same topic, what role do you think, with the reintroduction of earmarks, do you think that that's going to lead to more successful solutions in getting an omnibus climate bill passed? Or do you think that will maybe not add anything and we'll still get smaller topics, or we'll only get smaller topics in climate passed?
I'm sorry, could you flesh out the earmark part of the question?
Yeah, I hope I'm using the right word. It's when a congressman or congresswoman gets a certain amount of money for their jurisdiction, essentially. And I believe that was added back into the Senate and or the House recently. I forget which one. But basically it allows that if you're working on a large scale bill, you might be able to get someone across the aisle to engage a little bit more because they get X amount of dollars for their residents to do one particular project.
Oh, do I think that the process of sweetening the deal will ever go away?
Yeah.
I do not think it will ever go away, because that is how politicking, is often accomplished. So I can't necessarily speak to that. I would say that no side is going to get everything that they want, and if smaller concessions lead to larger agreements, I would have to look at it obviously case by case, but I can't be just opposed to that in principle.
Anybody else?
Really good, great job, Julie. On one of your slides, you said the U.S. is ranked 40 out of 76. Do you know which country is ranked #1, and if there's anything we can learn from them?
Chrissy, I'm really sorry. I couldn't hear your question very clearly. Who is #1?
Yeah, so like the U.S. was ranked 40 out of 70 in environmental. So who's ranked
Right.
#1, and how? Is there anything we can learn from them if you saw that in your research?
Yes, so it's a collection of the Scandinavian countries are all in the mix for #1. And they have really, I know that they have smaller populations and smaller areas to work with, but one thing that I was really struck by as I was studying those that were ranked higher, along those criteria, was that everything started with the commitment. They didn't necessarily know how they were going to get there, but they made the commitment first. And so the very first step of their process was divesting actually from fossil fuel interests, and then solving the problem kind of followed. I can't imagine it just followed out of thin air, but they didn't leave themselves. I feel like the United States is trying to leave itself a way to preserve as much of the fossil fuel industry as they can, because they don't want to completely say, we'll never use fossil fuels. And that kind of hedging, I think, might be fine, again, politically, depending on the situation. But there are some countries that have basically said, nope, Fossil fuel interests in any form are detrimental to our climate goals, and our climate goals are more important than the interests of that particular industry. So that was an interesting thing to learn.
Really good job, Julie. So I've been trying to think of how to pose this question. You made a statement to domestic corporations and essentially regulating themselves, and then having the federal government also come in and regulate. I think those who oppose regulation would make an argument that regulation costs companies and then ultimately costs consumers more. And with regulation, we may run the risk of losing those industries, losing jobs, and outsourcing our emissions. So is there any sort of policy in mind that you can think of that would account for that and still meet these GHG reductions?
Well, this might speak to how many years I've been a mother, but I almost want to say, don't make me come regulate you, and offer industry the opportunity to regulate themselves first. And if they don't do a good job with it, then we're going to have to step in. That doesn't totally answer your question, but that's my first thought.
There are also situations in which regulations have actually ended up stimulating innovation, and they've worked to the benefit of the company over the long term.
I think that's an excellent point. Sometimes parameters inspire creativity, and you come up with solutions that you would not be challenged to otherwise, for sure. Thank you for that comment. Anything else?